Welcome to Harvard Business Review Live. My name is Deborah Grayson Riegel. I'm a principal and the director of learning for the Boda Group, a leadership and team development firm. And I'm also a lecturer of management communications at the Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania. And today we're going to be talking about how to give and receive feedback, and whether your organization still does traditional performance reviews or you have scrapped the entire process. Everybody in an organization needs to know how to give feedback, and equally as importantly, they need to know how to receive feedback as well. And I know for many of us, it's the time of the year for annual performance reviews, and this is also an everyday, around the year process. So let's take a moment to talk about what it is we're going to cover in our time together today. First, we're going to start with the benefits and challenges of giving feedback. We'll then cover when to give feedback and when to halt, when you actually shouldn't be giving feedback. We'll then cover debunking the famous feedback sandwich. We'll move on to 5 elements of a feedback conversation, and then we will cover how to receive feedback. And I firmly believe that feedback should indeed be a conversation. It should not be a monologue. It should be a dialogue. And we want to model that in today's Harvard Business Review live presentation. So what I'm going to be reminding you to do is to really contribute in the comments section. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions about things that feel meaningful to you. And I'm going to be asking you questions as well. I would really like you to contribute to today's conversation, much as a feedback conversation should be a two-way street. So let's actually start with defining some terms. So we're going to come over here for a second and talk about feedback. So a very basic definition of feedback is information about reactions to a product, a person's performance of a task, used as a basis for improvement. Now, there are 2 parts of this definition that I want to really call out. Number 1 is information, and number 2 is used as a basis for improvement. And when you think about feedback as information used as a basis for improvement, you might ask yourself, why does this make people so nervous? And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about why giving feedback and receiving feedback makes people so uncomfortable. But before we talk about the discomfort, let's just take a moment to talk about some of the benefits of feedback-rich cultures. So in organizations that have feedback-rich cultures, we notice, the research shows us that there are several benefits. And I'm going to take a moment to cover these benefits. And while I'm doing that, I invite you to contribute the thoughts that you have about your organization. If you currently work in an organization with a feedback-rich culture, or you've ever worked in an organization with a feedback-rich culture, we'd like to get a sense from you of some of the benefits that you've experienced as well. So here's what the research shows. It shows us that in cultures that are really strong in feedback, there's enhanced immunity for the people who work there. There is decreased burnout. There is less physical illness, which of course means less time off from work. There is greater longevity over the course of a career and increased job satisfaction. And when you think about what it is that we want from our cultures at work, these are the things that we want. We want people to be happy and healthy. We want people to stay for a long time and be happy while they're there. And much of these benefits feels to me really aligned with David McClelland's theory of human motivation. And when you think about feedback, when delivered well and when received well, it really meets the 3 factors of his theory. It speaks to people's need for achievement. When people get feedback, they understand what they're accomplishing or how far away they might be from what it is they're trying to achieve. It certainly aligns with affiliation. When you give and receive feedback and do it well, it bonds people together, it strengthens relationships, it lets people know that they matter, and everybody wants to know that they matter. And then the third part is around power. People actually want to get some feedback on what they can control and what they can't control, and how they're doing on the parts of their work where they have autonomy and want to have increasing autonomy. So let's check in. Let's see if anybody here has had the opportunity to reflect on their culture. Any additional benefits you might want to add to the conversation?
Yes, thank you, everybody. Please keep the comments coming. If you are in a feedback-rich culture, please do post how you found it beneficial. We did get a comment in from Cynthia, and she writes, "Feedback has helped me grow."
Thank you, Cynthia. I'm glad that it's helped you grow. And what we find is that when people receive feedback, they certainly grow professionally, they grow personally, and they grow interpersonally as well. So let's take a moment and move on to the downside of feedback, right? So it's clear that feedback-rich cultures have their benefits, and yet we know that giving and receiving feedback can be particularly challenging. So let's take a look at the science behind why giving and receiving feedback is challenging. And as I cover what some of the research shows, I want to invite you once again to talk about what it is that maybe prevents you or makes you anxious about giving feedback, as well as some of the things that feel like they get in the way for you when receiving feedback. So we really want your feedback on that. So here is what we know. We know that there are two major sources of stress. One source of stress is impersonal. The other source of stress is interpersonal. And giving and receiving feedback is a form of interpersonal stress. It causes stress between people. And so a difference I like to highlight between impersonal stress and interpersonal stress is impersonal stress is you're driving to work and the tire blows. What are you mad at? You're mad at the tire, right? And maybe the traffic. Interpersonal stress is if your husband, wife, or partner was supposed to take the tires in to be checked, and then the tire blew on the way to work, that now causes interpersonal stress. And what we know is that interpersonal stress raises our levels of cortisol far higher than impersonal stress. And not only does it raise those physical symptoms, the recovery time is a lot longer. It takes a lot longer when you are experiencing interpersonal stress in order to get those stress levels down. And that's not all. We also know that giving feedback can feel like you are socially rejecting someone. Why? Because receiving feedback, particularly negative feedback, feels like a form of social rejection. And studies show that when people experience social rejection, they experience actual physical pain. An experiment was done asking 600 healthy volunteers to take some pain medicine, an over-the-counter pain medicine, over the course of a couple of weeks. And they found that when those people were delivered messages of things that could be experienced as social rejection, those who had taken the painkillers experienced far less physical pain than those who hasn't. And now you may be thinking to yourself, well, maybe I'll replace the bowl of M&Ms on my desk with a bowl of acetaminophen. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is that if you have anxiety about causing somebody feelings of harm and actually physical pain, feedback, when not delivered properly, can absolutely cause that. And so we want to make sure that by the end of our time together today, you really have an understanding of how to deliver feedback well. And I'll give you a little bit of a sneak preview that feedback that actually puts people in interpersonal stress and causes the pain of social rejection is feedback that is focused on people's personality. We know that when feedback is focused on task and work-related activities and doesn't include comments about somebody's personality, the feelings of social rejection are less, and therefore the pain of delivering and receiving feedback is a lot less as well. So I had said that we would check in with you to get a sense of what feels hard for you about giving or receiving feedback. Any comments?
We do have one. Basically, I think you touched on this a little bit, but just the idea of you're hurting someone's ego when you are giving feedback, if you have any recommendations on how to make that a little bit easier.
Yeah, so that's a really good suggestion. And one thing that I can tell you is you actually cannot control how another person hears and receives the feedback. We are going to walk you through some steps that will help it be easier and recognize that everybody is going to receive it in a different way. And highlighting the fact that you want to make sure that your comments are focused on task and work-related activities and not about somebody's personality or character. That will actually, in most cases, minimize some of the pain.
We do have another question related from Natalie, and she's asking, but what do you do if you try to give feedback to someone and they're on the defensive and not open to the discussion?
Yeah, so that is a very common situation, and one thing that I would ask you to do is to think about whether this is a pattern, and we'll be talking in a little bit about patterns of behavior. And if you recognize that there's a pattern of behavior where somebody isn't open to the feedback or isn't making changes based on the feedback, that is in fact a different kind of feedback conversation you're going to need to have. I call it a feedback about how you receive feedback conversation, which is separate from any other kind of feedback. I actually cover this in detail in my Harvard Business Review article on how to give feedback to an employee who doesn't want your feedback. And one thing that I would suggest is that you have a conversation that feels entirely separate from any other performance-related feedback that you want to give them, that is just about your experience of them as they receive feedback and what you'd like to see differently. And the 5 elements of a feedback conversation, which we're going to cover in a little bit, will help guide you through the steps of that conversation. And one caveat that I'm going to give you is that the surest way to make somebody defensive is to tell them that you experience them as being defensive. So I would invite you that as you're experiencing somebody as being defensive, to actually break that down into the observable behaviors that you're noticing that you are interpreting as defensive. Take the word defensive out of the conversation and talk about behaviors that you notice. Okay, let's see what we've covered. So we've talked about some benefits and challenges, and now we're going to talk a little bit about when to give and when to receive feedback, or when to not give feedback. So once again, I'm inviting you to be a part of the conversation. I would like your thoughts about when you think it is appropriate to give feedback. And there are some parts of giving feedback that certainly make sense. You're going to give feedback at annual performance reviews. My strong belief is that feedback shouldn't be saved for once a year. It shouldn't be a special occasion. Feedback is something that should be given on a regular basis. And anytime that you end a project is a terrific opportunity to give feedback. I know for myself and my team at the Boda Group, every single time we complete a client engagement, we sit down with all of the members of the team and give feedback. What went well and what could we do better next time? And that is a part of our culture now. You certainly want to give feedback if you have noticed that somebody has made a change based on prior feedback that you've given them, right? So whether it is negative feedback or positive feedback, if you've noticed that somebody has made a positive change, give them positive feedback. And if you're noticing that a change hasn't happened and you've given enough time to look for that change, you certainly want to give feedback there as well. You want to give feedback when you are noticing a pattern of behavior. And I had mentioned before that we'd talk a little bit about that. In most cases, you might not need to give negative feedback in particular when you've noticed a behavior happen only once. What you might want to do is notice the behavior once and say, that's interesting. The second time you notice the behavior, you can start to think to yourself, I wonder if this is a pattern. And then the third time you can say, yep, that looks like a pattern of behavior, and then go ahead and approach it. And I recognize that I'm using the word behavior here. Let me take a moment to clarify what I mean by behavior. A behavior is something that is measurable, observable, and repeatable. So it's something that a video camera like this might pick up. That's a behavior, and that's what you want to be talking about. Another time that you know that you should be giving feedback is one of my personal favorites, but probably not one of yours, is anytime you think to yourself, I really, really don't want to deal with this. When your gut tells you that there's something that you don't want to deal with, that is a sign that it is time to give feedback, and in fact, it may actually feel like you've waited a little bit too long. So I'm curious to know out there, for those of you who are participating, when do you think you should give feedback, and whether anybody is having I really, really don't want to deal with this experience, where now you know that is a sure cue that it is time to give some feedback.
We have a comment here from Anita, and she's saying, if you're trying to help someone address a potentially career-derailing issue, it's appropriate to give honest feedback, even if it causes discomfort, right?
Absolutely. So thank you for the comment, and the comment was, if you are potentially giving somebody some feedback to help them, stop them from derailing their career, You don't worry so much about the ego impact. You really want to make sure that they have what they need in order to grow. And I would say that that's actually a really good prompt for the idea of when you don't wait for a pattern of 3 in your behaviors. You want to make sure that the first time somebody has made a sexist, racist, or homophobic remark, you don't wait for a pattern of 3, you deal with that right away. Anytime that somebody creates an opportunity where there's reputational risk, where there's physical risk, where there's financial risk, any of those kinds of risks, you don't wait for a pattern of behavior. Anything else we should be hearing from our viewers?
Yes, so to answer the question that we posed, when to give feedback to people, Adam writes, feedback should be given on a regular basis. Giving and receiving feedback is not a special occasion.
Absolutely. Completely agree that feedback should be part of a regular diet. And like anything else that's part of a regular diet, once you do it on a regular basis, everybody gets used to it and it becomes a part of the culture as opposed to something that has this incredible buildup of anxiety for once a year. So let's move on from there and let's talk about when to halt feedback. And I'm actually going to start with the acronym HALT. You should not be giving feedback if you are hungry, angry, lonely, or tired as the feedback giver. Any of those experiences will really cloud your judgment. You will not be your best self, and you also won't be as planful as you otherwise would be. You don't want to give feedback when you've given somebody a lot of other feedback recently, and that's actually one of the reasons why I think an annual performance review should actually just be pulling together all of the previous feedback that somebody has been given. It shouldn't be a whole new set of feedback. So you want to be mindful that behavior change is hard, and because behavior change is hard, you don't want to suggest that somebody change 10 behaviors. You want to give them 1 or 2 to do at a time and then evaluate how those changes are going. So hungry, angry, lonely, tired, you don't want to give feedback. You don't want to give an awful lot of feedback all at once. You also want to make sure that wherever possible, you are credible on the area that you are giving feedback in, right? So if I were giving somebody feedback about showing up late or canceling supervision meetings, I've got to make sure that I show up regularly on time or that I'm not regularly canceling supervision meetings. You want to make sure that you have enough credibility with the person and the topic in order to deliver it well. Any thoughts from all of you of when not to give feedback?
So we do have a few comments just asking, if someone feels very defensive or you do worry that they're going to take it too personally, is that an indicator of not to do it, or should you do something differently?
Yeah, so the question is, if you worry about somebody's reaction, how they might take it, often based on previous feedback conversations that maybe didn't go the way that you had hoped, what do you do? And so I hear this all the time from my clients. What do you do if you're afraid somebody is going to get emotional? What do you do if you're concerned that they're going to shut down the conversation? What do you do if you need to give feedback to somebody and you actually realize you don't have all of the facts? All of those could certainly become excuses. And in fact, I invite you to take a look at my Harvard Business Review article on when to skip a difficult conversation, because you might find some opportunities in there where you actually don't have to give feedback. My suggestion is that you lead the feedback conversation with the element of the conversation that feels most concerning to you. So imagine starting a feedback conversation by letting somebody know, I want to give you some feedback that I think is going to help improve your career. And I also know, based on previous conversations, that it might get emotional. Let's talk a little bit about what do we do if that happens. So actually bring the thing that you are concerned about right into the feedback conversation so you can address it together. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about when to give, when to halt. Let's cross that one off our checklist. This gives me a feeling of accomplishment that we're moving through. And we're going to just take a moment to debunk a really common feedback tool, which is the feedback sandwich. So let's take a look at this feedback sandwich over here. And many of you know that a feedback sandwich is what so many folks have been trained to do, which is to give people a piece of positive feedback, to give people a piece of negative feedback, and then that bottom bread is positive feedback again. I actually think of this as a guilt sandwich more than a feedback sandwich. Because when you think about it, what are you doing? You're feeling guilty for the fact that you might cause some pain or anxiety or even defensiveness with somebody. And then you give them the actual message, that's the meat in the sandwich. And then you want to clean up the emotional mess that you've made. And in fact, it makes the message messy, and it also undermines your professional credibility that you can't be seen as somebody who is a direct communicator when it comes to feedback. So I would say throw this sandwich out, put it at the bottom of your garbage pile, and take that bag out, never to be seen again. And of course, you want to replace it with something. So what do you replace it with? Well, you actually would replace it with a dramatic increase in positive feedback on a regular basis. So psychologist John Gottman, who is a relationship expert, talks about a particular ratio of positive to negative feedback in order to really boost the relationship. And that is a 5-to-1 ratio. So for every one piece of negative feedback that you're going to give someone, somewhere you need to give them 5 pieces of positive feedback so that the relationship can withstand what feels like often an emotional blow, even when delivered artfully. You want to make sure that the relationship is strong enough to withstand it. And if you're not a math person, or you fear that you will spend all day sitting in front of an Excel spreadsheet mapping your 5-to-1 ratio, I have another way for you to think about it. Another way for you to think about it is the example of deposits into the relationship bank account. So a deposit in the relationship bank account is anything that puts trust in, that builds trust and strengthens the relationships between people. A withdrawal is anything that takes trust or goodwill out of the relationship. And so always be thinking about, how can I be putting more deposits into the relationship bank account than the withdrawals I'm taking? And if you're focused on increasing the deposits, the relationship will be able to withstand negative feedback. So I would like a commitment from everybody who is viewing this that you will stop serving a feedback sandwich. It undermines your professional credibility and it muddies the message, and that you will dramatically look for opportunities to increase positive feedback. Do I have any positive feedback on that suggestion?
People are definitely, I feel like a lot of people have heard about the feedback sandwich and are very much kind of wed to it.
Yes.
And I think there is a little bit of, concern that if you do steer away from the feedback sandwich, you may end up offending someone when you do give that one piece of negative feedback.
Yes.
So we just do still have a bit of concern about how to actually give that negative piece.
Yep. So we're gonna get there really shortly, right? How do you give it, and how do you keep from offending someone? And let me just say, you have no control over anybody else's behavior or anybody else's reaction. You may offend somebody, and if you have enough deposits in the relationship bank account, you'll be able to clean up that relationship mess pretty quickly. It will bounce back and it will be resilient, which is yet another reason to look for opportunities to increase positive feedback. Okay, so we have debunked the feedback sandwich, and now let's go into some strategy. We're going to talk about 5 elements of a feedback conversation, and before that, there are actually 2 things you want to consider before doing that. The first is asking for permission to have the feedback conversation, and the second is to state your intention, why you're giving this feedback. So let's just take a moment to talk about asking for permission. It's something that's nice to do, especially if giving feedback or giving negative feedback feels like a new element in the relationship that you are creating. Sometimes if you are the manager and you're giving feedback to a direct report, it might feel awkward to ask for permission. It's your job to give them feedback. So what you might want to do is ask them if this is a good time, right? Are they in the middle of something else? Are they feeling hungry, angry, lonely, or tired? Are they open to hearing feedback as well? And in Amy Gallo's Harvard Business Review article on how to give feedback to your boss, which is a very tricky topic for so many people, she says that asking for permission to give feedback is a crucial part of being able to give feedback up. So the first is asking for permission, whether that's permission to have the conversation or permission just to whether this is a good time. And then the second is to state the intention of the feedback conversation. And this actually has two parts. The first part is actually getting really clear for yourself about what your intention is, and assuming that the intention, you can make a case to yourself that it is a positive, productive intention, then actually letting the other person know what your intention is. So, is this a good time for me to give you a little bit of feedback? And the reason that I'd like to give you some feedback is that I'd like to help you serve our clients more effectively. That's asking for permission and stating your intention. And again, the first part of stating your intention is stating it to yourself. I was once coaching a leadership team where one person experienced the other team members' feedback in a really challenging way. She felt embarrassed and hurt by the feedback that was delivered in a public environment. And when we asked the other leader what his intention was, he said that his intention was to humiliate. Well, she certainly experienced the humiliation of that, and had he had a moment to check his intention or check his intention out with me, chances are that he wouldn't have had to deliver feedback that had such a devastating impact on the person whose behavior he was trying to improve. In fact, it made things worse. So these are the two pre-steps, and now let's talk about 5 elements of a feedback conversation. And we're going to start at the top. What compared to what? So what I know about you, and now what. So, what feedback? What is what feedback? What feedback is very simple feedback where you are just naming the behavior that you see, and then you stop talking. And I don't know about you, but when I get nervous, I am very likely to over-talk my case out of anxiety and out of guilt. And this is an opportunity for you just to name the behavior that you see and stop talking. So for example, David, I noticed that you interrupted our client 3 times in our strategy meeting today. Your sound didn't go out. I just stopped talking. And here's when what feedback will work. What feedback tends to work when you are dealing with somebody who is self-directed, self-motivated, committed to their relationship with you, and committed to their own career development. But if one or more of those factors are missing, it might not be enough for somebody to self-correct after you just naming the behavior. And oftentimes it is. And there's absolutely no reason to drag out a feedback conversation longer than it needs to go if somebody can hear the feedback immediately and self-correct. So the first step of a feedback conversation might be what, literally just naming the behavior that you see. And sometimes that won't be enough. So the second step of a feedback conversation is what compared to what. This is also known as dynamic feedback, and it's a reminder of the behavior that you see compared to the agreement or the expectation or even the rule. I would imagine that most of us have seen an example of this in action. Chances are anytime you've driven through a school zone, you've noticed a sign, and the sign says, speed limit 25, your speed 80. Well, hopefully not 80. Your speed 35, right? So it's reminding you, here's the guideline, and here's what you are doing compared to the guideline, or the law in that case. And what's so powerful about what compared to what feedback is that when you remind people of what the behavioral expectation is, or the goal, or the agreement, as soon as possible, people are much more likely to see the feedback as true and to make an immediate correction on their own. And this is also a really good opportunity for you to think to yourself, was I clear about the expectation? Did I articulate what the rule is or how we do things around here? And if you find that you can't make the case that that person would have known it, that's a part of the feedback conversation where you take some ownership and responsibility as well. And let me reiterate, this should feel like a conversation. It should not be a monologue. The third part is so what. And this is the part of the conversation where you let somebody know the impact that their behavior has. And there's lots of different ways to talk about impact. One impact might be the impact that the behavior has on you as their manager, on the team overall, on the client or the project, on the company or organization, or even the impact that it has on them and their professional credibility and trajectory. Now, if you were to name all 5 of those impacts, that's overdoing it, and I think that would even be a form of bullying. You want to name the one impact that you think would resonate most for that person. And again, it's the impact it has on you, the impact it has on the team, the impact on the client or the project, the impact on the organization, and the impact that it has on them as well. Our 4th step is what I call the oasis in a negative feedback conversation. And of course, you can use this model for positive feedback as well. This is what I know about you, and this is a reminder of what you know to be true about this person's set of behavior overall, even their character, that allows you to put this one piece of behavioral feedback in context, right? So let's go back to David, who interrupted the client 3 times in a meeting, right? So David, you interrupted the client 3 times. The way that we approach our client strategy meetings is that we let the client complete their thoughts and then we ask questions. My sense is that the impact that it had on the client was that they didn't feel heard or listened to. And one thing I know about you, David, is that you are very committed to our client's satisfaction. And that's part of what surprised me about this, and I want to let you know that I know that to be true about you. That reminds David that this piece of feedback is in the context of this incident. You are not making a blanket statement about him.